For a list of books, articles, and documentaries we used to research this episode, click on the link in the show notes, or follow us on Twitter @FiascoPod.
Ronald Reagan makes his debut today as America's leading man.
On the morning of January 20th, 1981, the White House was preparing for the arrival of a new president. But some unfinished business was threatening to overshadow the festivities.
Reagan may be the first president who won't be the day's top news story. Thanks over everything.
This whole business of the hostages referred to more than 50 Americans who were being held prisoner in Iran. They had been there for more than a year, locked inside the U.S. Embassy in Tehran by a group of young radicals.
The U.S. Embassy in Tehran has been invaded and occupied by Iranian students. The American hostages were blindfolded, handcuffed, and marched out on the U.S. Embassy's front steps by the revolutionary students. The Iranians had fought U.S. Marine Guards for 3 hours for control of the embassy.
The hostage crisis started in November of 1979. Iran had just undergone a revolution a few months earlier. The Shah, Iran's long-serving U.S.-backed leader, had been overthrown and exiled. Islamic fundamentalists who called America the Great Satan had taken power. American news networks reported that Iran's new supreme leader, the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, had given the hostage-takers his blessing.
The move has the Ayatollah's personal support, which adds to Washington's difficulty in trying to resolve this dangerous situation.
President Jimmy Carter tried to pressure Iran into releasing the hostages. His administration cut diplomatic ties with the Khomeini government, and they froze Iranian state assets in U.S. banks. Carter even authorized a secret rescue mission, but it ended in disaster.
Thousands of jubilant Iranians gathered outside to celebrate the defeat and disgrace of America. The United States tried to free the hostages and failed.
None of the hostages were released, and 8 American servicemen were killed in a helicopter crash. The failed mission made Carter look hapless and ineffective, and the crisis continued. Americans turned on their televisions for nightly updates. Walter Cronkite began signing off at the end of every broadcast by noting the number of days the Americans had been held captive.
And that's the way it is. Tuesday, February 19th, 1980, the 108th day of captivity, the 222nd day of captivity, the 377th day of captivity for American hostages in Iraq.
Carter's efforts to win the hostages' release stretched into his re-election campaign.
The Republicans are itching to turn the hostage crisis against the administration.
The administration has botched it so bad that we're left with very few options.
The hostage issue hovered over the whole campaign, and it was something that just so damaged Carter.
That's journalist Jane Mayer, who covered the Reagan administration for the Wall Street Journal and co-authored the book Landslide.
And the idea of Carter being weak was really the thing that was hammered over and over again and played a big part in why he lost.
Reagan's inauguration in 1981 marked the 444th day of the hostage crisis. The outgoing Carter administration had hoped it would be the last.
This has been quite a suspense-filled evening. Jimmy Carter, his last night in the White House, spent it in the Oval Office working with his aides.
The day before, they had notified the press that a deal had been reached to finally free the Americans. The hostages were still not home.
President of the United States, Jimmy Carter.
At the inauguration ceremony, Carter walked to the dais where Reagan was about to be sworn in. Even then, reporters were yelling out to him for confirmation that the hostages were being released.
Whether you could hear or not, but President Carter was just asked if the hostages are out, and he responded saying, not yet, not yet.
The Iranians were not going to release the hostages on Carter's watch. They waited until after Reagan was sworn in before allowing them to leave Tehran. As Carter traveled home to Georgia, Reagan got to announce the good news.
Some 30 minutes ago, the planes bearing our prisoners left Iranian airspace and are now free.
But it had been a wrenching day for Mr. Carter. An aide said he had been terribly hurt and disappointed when he was not able to announce the release of the hostages before leaving office this morning.
The simultaneous inauguration of Reagan and the hostages getting out enabled him to take full credit for it and sort of appear to be the savior.
A week later, Reagan welcomed the hostages home in a ceremony in the Rose Garden.
At the White House, a welcome fit for a king, the kind of South Lawn ceremony usually reserved for visiting heads of state.
Welcome home. You are home, and believe me, you are welcome.
But the triumphant moment also created a liability for the Reagan administration.
It so publicly associated them with this act that it upped the ante for Reagan. He was more vulnerable than maybe other presidents would have been to being manipulated on the issue because he'd made this sort of his selling point.
Later, one of Reagan's counterterrorism analysts expressed regret over the spectacle. Where did we first go wrong? 1981, he said. Once we had the Rose Garden ceremony, we had attached huge political benefit to the return of U.S. hostages. In other words, Reagan had set himself up for a potential hostage crisis of his own. I'm Leon Navak. From Luminary Media and Prologue Projects, this is Fiasco.
7 Americans kidnapped over the past 15 months. 7 Americans who have disappeared.
The Reagan administration's response to the series of kidnappings has been one of almost total silence.
They did not want to have a hostage problem like Jimmy Carter had.
Maybe they can get the hostages out.
I can assure you that no deal was made. The impression left by all of this is that things are afoot.
The only person that could have stopped it was me, and I didn't do it.
This week, how Ronald Reagan tried to avoid Jimmy Carter's fate by extending a hand to one of America's sworn enemies. Among the advisors and aides who joined Ronald Reagan in the White House was a soft-spoken and cerebral retired Marine named Robert Bud McFarlane. McFarlane's domain was foreign policy. As a student at the U.S. Naval Academy, he had longed to have a hand in shaping America's relationship to the rest of the world.
And I had to think with all the rigor I could muster about the elements of power and their nature and their limits.
This is Bud McFarlane, speaking to me this winter in Washington, D.C.
All that is not unique to me. I mean, hundreds, thousands of people go through as good or better schools than I did and get this foundation knowledge and self-confidence that, yes, you can contribute constructively because you know the rules and you occasionally have a lucid interval and even imagination that can make the world a better place.
Perhaps more than anyone else in the Reagan White House, Bud McFarlane feels personally responsible for the events that led to Iran-Contra. When I first approached him about an interview, he made it clear that rehashing the story of the scandal would be painful.
Remorse doesn't quite capture it. I'd failed my country.
McFarlane's career in government began during the Nixon administration, when he worked for Henry Kissinger.
Henry Kissinger has been on the road conferring, negotiating, and meeting with heads of
the same job Henry Kissinger had held a decade earlier.
Robert McFarlane will be confirmed as National Security Advisor. But I want to thank you for accepting this new challenge. All of us look forward to working with you in the coming months.
From the beginning of his tenure as National Security Advisor, McFarlane had a special interest in Iran. He believed that even though Iran was led by the intensely anti-American Ayatollah Khomeini, the U.S. might have a chance to intervene in the country's politics.
Conscious of Iran's strategic and economic importance, the administration wants to keep the door open to possible reconciliation. But while Khomeini lives, that seems a distant hope.
I really didn't imagine that we had a plausible prospect of being able to engage with this government. I did think, however, that there were reasons why.
Into an ally, the way they had been before the revolution.
I mean, you'd have to have the very senior leadership of the military who had become demoralized, and that's theory. But it was a very plausible possibility that the military would be the instrument of changing the regime in a relatively bloodless coup.
McFarlane had a specific reason for thinking that Iran was vulnerable to an internal coup. As he saw it, the country was stuck between two foreign powers, Iraq to the west and the Soviet Union to the northeast. In Iraq, the problem was Saddam Hussein, who had invaded Iran in 1980, right after the Iranian Revolution. The war that followed was unimaginably violent. Hundreds of thousands of people were being killed.
A war that started months ago with fretful skirmishes. A war that no one now seems able to stop.
Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was just sort of looming over Iran.
On its northern border, Iran worries about 24 Soviet divisions.
The two countries shared a border, and McFarlane had no doubt that the Soviets, who had recently invaded Afghanistan, wanted to gain influence in the Middle East. He thought maybe there were people within the Iranian leadership who were concerned about the same thing.
Out of self-interest that ought to have nurtured a dissident element.
There was just one problem. McFarlane didn't have any evidence that these dissidents actually existed. He was thinking strategically, just like Kissinger had taught him. To put that another way, McFarlane was using his imagination. And to be fair, there wasn't much else he could do. Concrete intelligence about what was happening in the Iranian government was very hard to come by. The relationship between Iran and the U.S. was openly hostile.
Leading officials of the Reagan administration repeatedly have accused Iran of sponsoring terrorist attacks against the United States.
In 1984, the Reagan administration officially designated the Khomeini regime a state sponsor of terrorism. They enforced an arms embargo that prevented the U.S. government from selling weapons to Iran, and launched a diplomatic campaign to pressure other countries to do the same.
The burning of the American flag, the shouts of death to America.
At Friday prayers, Iranian imams led chants of death to America. So it was chilly between the Reagan White House and the Khomeini regime. But then, in July of 1985, Bud McFarlane received a visit from a trusted associate bearing good news. It turned out that the people McFarlane had been imagining, the dissidents within the Iranian regime, were in fact real. and they wanted to talk. Around the same time, a related crisis was unfolding in the Middle East.
The American University of Beirut today is under heavier guard than usual. The U.S. Embassy there, citing intelligence reports, has warned that pro-Iranian extremists are planning mass kidnappings of Americans on the campus.
John Weir was in his 20s when his father was taken hostage in Lebanon.
I remember talking to my sisters and my sisters being upset, my mom being very upset.
It was 6 months into Bud McFarlane's tenure as National Security Advisor, and about 3 years since the American hostages taken in Tehran were returned home. John Weir's father, the Reverend Benjamin Weir, was a Presbyterian minister who'd been assigned to Beirut, the capital city of Lebanon. Weir was kidnapped as he and his wife Carol were leaving their apartment.
And not too far from the edge of the apartment building, a car pulled up, some guys got out and grabbed my dad. My mom tried to fight them off. She's not much of a fighter. And they basically just muscled him into the car and drove off.
In the 1980s, Lebanon was embroiled in a brutal sectarian civil war, and Islamic militia groups began kidnapping European and American citizens. The group that captured Benjamin Weir was associated with Hezbollah, which enjoyed the support of the Khomeini regime in Iran. By 1985, Weir was one of 7 Americans being held hostage in Lebanon.
7 Americans kidnapped in Beirut over the past 15 months. 7 Americans who have disappeared.
In addition to Weir, the group of hostages included a Catholic priest, a correspondent for the Associated Press, and 3 employees of the American University in Beirut. In the federal government, administration officials were most concerned with one hostage in particular, a CIA operative named William Buckley.
William Buckley, a political officer at the U.S. Embassy in Beirut, was kidnapped.
He was kidnapped on March the 16th, 1984.
Buckley had been with the CIA for decades, working in Zaire, Cambodia, Egypt, and Pakistan. When he was kidnapped, he was the head of the CIA's operations in Beirut, though that was not public information at the time. News outlets identified Buckley only as a political officer at the U.S. Embassy. In January of 1985, Buckley's captors released a videotape of him to prove that he was still alive.
The 22nd of January, 1985. I am well.
In the video, Buckley appeared weak and his voice sounded thin. Intelligence officials feared that the kidnappers were torturing him in order to get CIA secrets. As Buckley's captivity stretched into its 2nd year, it weighed on the minds of administration officials like McFarlane, CIA Director William Casey, and President Reagan himself. But the administration seemed to be avoiding drawing attention to the hostage situation as much as possible.
The Reagan administration's response to the series of kidnappings has been one of almost total silence. What a complete contrast to the actions of the Carter administration when Iranian extremists seized the American embassy in Tehran more than 5 years ago.
Here again is John Weir.
The Reagan White House had made a lot of political hay out of Jimmy Carter's issues with the hostages in Iran. And it was pretty clear to us that they were kind of suppressing as much as they could discussion of hostages or use of the word hostages. And they did not want to have a hostage problem like Jimmy Carter had.
The administration had also publicly committed itself to an ironclad principle. America does not negotiate with terrorists.
Terrorists and those who support them must and will be held to account.
The principle was that, we should never deal with terrorists.
Here's Jane Mayer again.
That you do not honor them by dealing with them. And they took a very hard line on it.
The Reagan administration communicated a consistent message to the Weir family. Just lay low. The government is doing everything it can. They even had a phrase for it: quiet diplomacy.
Quiet diplomacy was their explanation of why we had no idea what they were doing. We would say, so what are you doing? Oh, well, we're using quiet diplomacy.
Eventually, Benjamin Weir's wife, Carol, took matters into her own hands. She had lived in Lebanon for more than 30 years, and she knew a lot of people. She began traveling around the region, talking to religious leaders, following leads of her own, and comparing notes with her contacts at the U.S. Embassy.
She would ask them, who have you seen? And there were a couple of occasions when they mentioned some people, And she said, well, I've already seen that person. So, she started trying to figure out who had them, what was going on, what did they want. But after we'd heard quiet diplomacy long enough, we decided that the quiet diplomacy was just a way of trying to pacify us and that we needed to ratchet things up.
Finally, Carol Weir decided that she needed to relocate to the United States and take her message to Washington.
The wife of the Reverend Benjamin Weir was in Washington today seeking more help for her husband.
It's 417 days now for me since my husband was kidnapped. That's a long time, and I believe they have been forgotten.
The Weirs used the resources of the Presbyterian Church to launch a public pressure campaign. They spoke at churches and gave press conferences. They organized an effort to get 1 million letters written to the administration. In one speech, Carol Weir invoked the Iranian hostage crisis that had consumed the nation's attention just a few years earlier. She asked if she would have to wait 444 days to see her husband. During his first term, Reagan's closest aides had tried to prevent the president from directly engaging with the hostage families.
The old aides who knew him well tried to keep people with hard luck stories away from him. That is the truth about Reagan, was that whenever there was somebody who was an individual with a problem that was near him, he had a tendency to be empathetic and he could be manipulated.
Reagan's minders had feared that if he met with the hostage families, he would begin pushing to get their loved ones released at any cost. He might be tempted to violate his policy of never negotiating with terrorists. But by the summer of 1985, many of Reagan's first-term aides were no longer around. Without them there to hold him back, the president began to fixate on the hostages, asking about them in meetings nearly every day and agonizing over their continued captivity.
He basically got drawn in and hooked and became emotionally involved in the situation. And he made clear that he cared and he really wanted these hostages out and something done about it. And his motto, which he often said to his aides, was, "Don't bring me problems, bring me solutions."
In July of 1985, National Security Advisor Bud McFarlane approached the president with a possible solution. In his diary, Reagan wrote, "Some strange soundings are coming from the Iranians. Bud M. will be here tomorrow to talk about it. It could be a breakthrough on getting our 7 kidnap victims back." McFarlane's meeting with Reagan was prompted by a conversation he had had 2 weeks earlier with a senior Israeli diplomat. The diplomat's name was David Kimke. He had previously served as deputy director of Mossad, Israel's intelligence agency, and McFarlane trusted his judgment. According to McFarlane, Kimke told him that Israel had been in touch with Iranians who were disaffected by the turmoil in their country, and who were both willing and able to change the government.
It was simply stated that there are elements in the Iranian army that are prepared to open a dialogue with us that might lead to regime change, but that it would take probably years of nurture to do it. I was simply heartened, however, by the fact that he thought it might be nurtured and developed over time.
It was exactly what McFarlane had imagined. But there was a catch. The coup was not going to nurture itself. Before there could be any dialogue between the U.S. and these Iranian moderates, the Americans would have to do their new friends a good turn. They would have to sell them some weapons. Specifically, the Iranians wanted anti-tank missiles for use in their war against Iraq. It was a big request, but the Iranians were offering something valuable in return. They could use their influence over Hezbollah to bring about the release of William Buckley, Benjamin Weir, and all the other American hostages being held in Lebanon. At least, that's what David Kimke was telling Bud McFarlane.
Kimke presented it as their being able to achieve the release of the hostages. And that wasn't just his notion, but that it had been vetted by Iranians that he believed were worthy people.
How did David Kimke know they were worthy people? The answer lay with the man who was helping Israel make contact with the Iranian moderates. His name was Manucher Ghorbanifar. Ghorbanifar was an Iranian businessman living in Europe. He was a kind of international fixer, a guy who helped broker deals between parties who would otherwise have no reason to trust each other. And according to David Kimke, Ghorbanifar could connect the Americans to the moderates inside Iran, who were open, perhaps even eager, for a better relationship with the United States. If this all sounds convoluted, that's because it was. McFarlane, Kimke, Ghorbanifar, these nameless moderates in Iran, it's a bizarre daisy chain, and the mechanics of it aren't that important. The point is, a guy knew a guy who knew a guy who claimed to know some high-level Iranians who didn't see eye to eye with the anti-American Khomeini regime. Incredibly, that was enough to get the ball rolling. Over the course of several weeks in July, a specific proposal took shape, in which 100 American missiles would be traded for all 7 American hostages. The trade would serve as a demonstration of good faith. With mutual trust established, the two sides might then be able to start talking about the bigger picture, the eventual ouster of the Ayatollah. As McFarlane well knew, the deal would violate American policy in at least 2 ways. First, it would break the Reagan administration's rule against negotiating with terrorists. Second, it would undermine the international effort to stop weapons sales to Iran that the U.S. itself had introduced. Principles aside, the arms for hostages deal would depend entirely on the credibility of the mysterious Iranian fixer, Manucher Ghorbanifar, a man McFarlane didn't know at all.
I thought it was fraud. After all, unless you have absolute conviction in the integrity of the people you're dealing with, a barter for hostages is just an open door to encouraging more hostages being taken.
Nonetheless, McFarlane decided the opportunity was worth bringing to President Reagan. The risk was obvious, but so was the potential for a historic, world-changing moment. Remember, McFarlane's role model was Henry Kissinger, whose crowning achievement under Nixon was making a surprise opening to communist China. Here, Kimke, Ronald Reagan was in the hospital, recovering from surgery that removed a cancerous growth from his intestine. McFarlane came to Reagan's bedside to brief him on the potential opening to Iran. McFarlane says he mapped out the benefits, but was very clear on the downsides.
He said, "This is a very high-risk venture for you." I briefed him on the prospect that this could go wrong.
McFarlane told